This is how democracies lose control over war, not with explosions, but with votes. Last week, 5 Republican senators broke ranks. They voted with Democrats to limit President Donald Trump's military authority in Venezuela. For a moment, it looked historic. Congress remembering its power, the Constitution breathing again. 1 week later, it was gone. 2 senators flipped. A procedural maneuver killed the vote. 51-50. Vice President J.D. Vance broke the tie. No final debate, no accountability, no restraint. The president won. Congress stepped aside. This wasn't about ideology. It wasn't even about Venezuela. It was about fear, pressure, and how easily power bends institutions. If you care about who decides when America goes to war, stay with me, because what happened here matters far beyond this vote. And in the next moment, we need to ask a harder question. How did Congress let this happen so fast? To understand this moment, you have to strip away the drama and look at the structure. Congress was not voting on war. It was voting on authority. The resolution did one simple thing. It said the president could not escalate military action in Venezuela without coming back to Congress. That's it. No withdrawal mandate, no policy judgment. Just a reminder of who decides. This vote came after a surprise operation in Caracas, bombing radar targets, U.S. personnel on the ground, a mission carried out fast with minimal warning. For some senators, that crossed a line, not because they opposed the action, but because they feared the precedent. If this counts as nothing, then what counts as war? The administration's answer was procedural, technical, legalistic. And that's where the real story begins. Because once war becomes a process question, power stops looking dangerous and starts looking inevitable. And to see why this keeps happening, we have to go back. This tension didn't start with Venezuela. It's older, structural. For decades, Congress has handed away war authority, not in one vote, but in fragments. Presidents act first. Lawmakers react later, if at all. The Constitution is clear in theory. Congress declares war. The president commands the military. In practice, that line blurred long ago. Authorizations stretched. Emergencies redefined. Operations renamed. Not wars. Actions. Missions. Limited engagements. Each time Congress accepts the language, it accepts the logic. By the time U.S. forces struck targets in Caracas, the system already leaned toward the executive. Speed over deliberation. Secrecy over consent. So when senators tried to reassert control, they weren't challenging one decision. They were challenging a drift. And drifts are dangerous because no one feels responsible for them. That's why this moment mattered and why it collapsed so quickly. Because once the past teaches presidents they can move alone, the present becomes a formality. And then came the first real test. The crisis didn't explode on the battlefield. It exploded in the Senate. When the resolution advanced, President Donald Trump reacted immediately, publicly, furiously. He went online. He called Republican supporters of the measure ashamed. He warned they should never be elected again. This vote, he said, greatly hampers American self-defense and national security. Then it went private. Phone calls, angry, heated, yelling. One senator's conversation, we're told, didn't go well. This is how pressure works. Not subtle, not polite, relentless. And it worked. Within days, Josh Hawley and Todd Young changed course. Not because the facts changed, but because the cost did. If you think this kind of pressure is rare, pause here. This is what power looks like when it's unchecked. But the real pivot didn't come from Trump. It came from something quieter, something that sounded reasonable. And that's where the system revealed itself. What broke the resistance wasn't a threat. It was a promise, a letter, carefully worded, institutional. Secretary of State Marco Rubio offered assurances. No U.S. troops on the ground in Venezuela, no plans to send them, and if that ever changed, Congress would be notified. Notifications, letters, procedures, Rubio wrote that any deployment will be undertaken consistent with the Constitution, that the administration would transmit written notice, that congressional authorization would be sought, circumstances permitting. Those words mattered. For Josh Hawley, they became a release valve. He had voted yes because of the Constitution. Now he could vote no because he was told it would be respected. Todd Young went further. He said the vote itself was symbolic, a communications exercise, important, yes, but futile. Why challenge power if power will veto you anyway? This is the hidden mechanism. Congress doesn't surrender authority all at once. It trades it for reassurances that cannot be enforced. And once war becomes hypothetical, control becomes optional. That's how oversight disappears without anyone admitting it. And then reality returned. The second crisis was procedural, and that made it more dangerous. No tanks, no missiles, just a rule, a point of order, quiet, technical. With it, Senate Republicans blocked the resolution from ever reaching a final vote. The bipartisan effort died instantly, 51-50. Again, this time J.D. Vance didn't just break a tie, he sealed a precedent. 5 Republicans had once stood together, now only 3 remained. Rand Paul, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, they held the line. But lines don't matter when the system rotates around them. Paul called it what it was, a game, an elaborate ruse. The U.S. had already bombed Caracas, a military buildup sat offshore, and yet officially this was not a war. That fiction mattered, because if it isn't a war, Congress has nothing to stop. This is the modern escalation. Action first, definitions later. And by the time lawmakers argue over words, the reality is already locked in. That's how a democracy sleepwalks into conflict. And now the consequences move closer to home. Now let's bring this back to you. Because systems don't fail in the abstract. They fail in people's lives. When Congress steps aside, you lose something you never see. You lose the pause before war. That pause is where questions live. Costs, limits, exit plans. Without it, decisions move fast. Too fast for voters, too fast for debate. You're told operations are limited, temporary, necessary, until they aren't. If this can happen in Venezuela, it can happen anywhere. And when it does, it's your tax dollars, your sons and daughters, your future obligations. This isn't about party loyalty. It's about distance. The farther war decisions move from public consent, the easier they become. That's why this vote matters to you, even if you never follow Senate procedure, because democracy isn't loud when it breaks. It goes quiet. If you feel something is slipping, you're not imagining it. And if this analysis helped clarify that feeling, share it, because awareness is the last line of defense. And what happens next doesn't stop at America's borders. What happened in the Senate doesn't stay there, because when the United States acts without clear restraint, the world notices. Allies watch signals, not speeches. They see a president able to move militarily with minimal congressional resistance. They adjust expectations. Adversaries watch even more closely. If Venezuela can become a testing ground, then escalation becomes a template. Military action framed as limited, authority framed as inherent, oversight framed as optional. This creates a chain reaction. Diplomacy weakens when force looks easier than debate. Regional actors hedge. They prepare for instability, not resolution. And every time Congress fails to assert itself, the United States looks less predictable, not weaker, more dangerous, because unpredictability invites miscalculation. What began as a domestic power struggle now alters global assumptions about how American force is deployed. This is how local decisions reshape international order. And once that order shifts, it doesn't snap back easily. So the real question is no longer what just happened. It's what happens next. The future now splits into 3 paths. None of them are theoretical. The first is restraint. Congress learns from this moment. Lawmakers stop treating war votes as messaging. They draw lines early, before operations begin. In this future, power slows down, not because presidents want it to, but because the system demands it. The second path is drift. The most likely one: votes continue to signal concern, procedures continue to bury them, presidents act, Congress reacts, nothing breaks all at once, authority just keeps sliding, war becomes something America does before it debates. The third path is escalation. Presidents read silence as consent, limited missions expand, definitions stretch, and when Congress finally objects, it's already too late. This is the danger of precedents. They don't announce themselves, they wait. What happens in Venezuela doesn't decide the future alone, but it sets the logic, and once that logic hardens, reversing it takes more than a vote. It takes a crisis big enough to force attention, and that's the final irony. Democracies often reclaim control only after paying the price. And that brings us to the end. This story doesn't end with Venezuela. It ends with a choice. A choice about what kind of power America accepts. Because what happened here was not dramatic. No tanks on television, no declaration read aloud. Just senators deciding that restraint was optional. That is how authority concentrates, not through coups, through convenience. When war becomes a communications exercise, democracy becomes theater. Rand Paul was right to call it a ruse, because pretending something isn't war doesn't make it safer. It just makes it easier. And once Congress trains itself to step aside, future presidents won't need to shout. They'll just act. The most dangerous power is the power no one feels responsible for stopping. If you want to understand the next conflict before it begins, this is where you look. Not at the battlefield, at the process. If this analysis helped you see that more clearly, stay with me, share it, and watch the next vote closely, because the next time, there may not even be a debate to reverse